my argument.
Okay,
Yeah.
well then I would suggest that the way you define disaster is completely erroneous, because that wouldn't be a disaster. That is still gradual improvement that would be good, and the idea that somehow there's going to be this tipping point if we only decrease things 20% instead of 80, or I'm sorry, 20 units instead of 80 units, and that's going to lead to these unmitigated disasters is unwarranted. It's not true. And so
here's
when
what the disaster is, right? The disaster is climate change, okay? Like, we're barreling towards that future.
I don't believe that.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, but you got to explain stratospheric cooling then.
Sure.
If you can't, I don't know, because I'm not aware of any other explanation for stratospheric cooling other than the greenhouse gas effect.
Okay, so it's not. So let me explain what happens with climate change, right? There is a consensus that the climate is changing. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
There is a consensus. Now, the term consensus is weird. When I say it, I'm saying like 95% of the people that study this stuff agree. Is that fair? I don't mean 100%. You could obviously find one person.
Yes.
So when I say consensus, I'm not trying to be a dick about it, right? So there's also a consensus that humans have something to do with climate change, correct? You would agree with that. That's basically where the consensus ends. Like, for example, let me ask you this. By what point would we reach if emissions continue at a trend that we're expecting right now, at what point would we be beyond the point of no return? Is there a consensus?
That there would never be a consensus on that, because you could always have some sort of technology that reverses it in the future.
Absolutely true. Actually, you've made the greatest point why these models suck, because they never understand human ingenuity, right? For example,
but that's not something to bank on. I'm not just going to bank on technology.
Let me explain this. So, for example, when I was debating in 2003, 2004 in college, one of the topics one year was the United States should sign on to one of these treaties. One of the treaties was called the Kyoto Protocol. Did you ever hear of this?
I have.
The Kyoto Protocol said that all the signees would reduce emissions by 20% by the year 2020. Right? Does that sound familiar? Something like that. I think I'm getting the specifics on that right. The United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. It was very similar. It was sort of the beginning of a Paris Climate Accord type agreement, right? And yet, despite the fact that we didn't sign that, would you be shocked to know that the United States did, in fact, reduce their emissions 20% by the year 2020? Without signing it. Now, I was told, and people were reading credible evidence from scientists that said, without signing this accord and then instituting drastic policies to punish fossil fuels and completely curb the amount of fossil fuels, we'll never make this emission reduction, and that would be a disaster for the planet. And it turned out they were absolutely incorrect, because what they didn't take into effect was we didn't immediately need to collapse our economy by having something like a 40% reduction in fossil fuel usage. Instead, we were able to gradually, through ingenuity and other policies, ensure that we had a gradual change that met the goals that they were suggesting without having a disastrous effect to the economy. The people that talk about these radical things like, oh, we need to radically curb fossil fuel emissions, etc., all of these policies would directly harm the lowest class people, particularly in a country like the United States. It will be
I don't really think you can be talking about that.
Absolutely I can. Why not? For example, if we all pay...
His policies would directly harm all of the...
That's not true. For example, let's say, for example, that we say that we're going to limit the consumption of fossil fuels in this country by 20%. Yes. That would lead to an increase in prices of energy. So just say...
If it was indiscriminate, sure, or it could be targeted.
So how would you target that? So, for example, we say all coal plants now...
You change the regulations surrounding private jet travel.
So your argument is the coal plant, where the vast bulk of our energy is coming from, you wouldn't do anything to change them. You would just change regulations. The vast bulk of our
energy is not coming from coal.
Where's the bulk of our energy coming from?
I mean, in terms of a single source, probably oil, but it's not coal.
For like electricity?
Yeah.
Let me look this up.
Sure, you can. I don't really think it's very pertinent, but... Like, the point overall that you're trying to make is such that poor people will be the most adversely affected by overall energy reduction, like energy use reductions, which I agree with. Like, I'm not saying that like you just indiscriminately stop the total amount of energy use. Like, you can regulate it so that people that are unnecessarily burning energy for things like flying to a Taylor Swift concert or something can be regulated.
No, wait, I'm just curious. right? Because you're making declarative claims. So far, I caught you in, perhaps it was a misunderstanding on my part, but the idea when I asked you specifically if these emissions dropped under Trump, you said no, and then you were like, well, you were talking about estimates. So as someone who researches this heavily, do you have any idea where what leads to the majority of our electricity production?
You're telling me that it's coal?
No, I'm asking you specifically. I was guessing that it's coal. It's not. It wasn't until 2016. It is natural gas, but you didn't know that.
All right, that makes sense to me.
It seems odd that someone with your expertise seems to be pretty vague about specifics on these.